Metal screams before it breaks. High above the freezing overcast of 1,944 Germany, a 10,000-pound P-51 Mustang was shrieking its final warning to an 18-year-old farm boy named Arlett Doyle. Arlett possessed a fatal flaw. He couldn't accurately judge a high-speed dive, making him a walking bullseye for seasoned Luftwaffe veterans. Down in the mud of their English airfield, older pilots placed quiet bets on exactly which mission would dig his grave. Instead, a singular moment of sheer panic, a violent, cross-control flinch at terminal velocity, birthed an impossible aerodynamic glitch that slaughtered 7 elite German aces in seconds. Gravity has a specific sound when it is about to kill you. It is the high-pitched, tearing shriek of wind, rushing over the aluminum canopy of a North American P-51D Mustang, drowning out even the deafening roar of the Packard-built Merlin engine. For aviation cadet Arlett Doyle, that sound was the soundtrack of his failures. It was November 1944. The grass airstrip at RAF Bodny was permanently slick with frost and oil. The men of the 352nd Fighter Group were fighting a war of attrition, escorting heavy bombers deep into the industrial heartland of the Third Reich. They needed pilots desperately. They needed killers. What they had received in the latest replacement batch was Arlett, a skinny kid from a dairy farm in Idaho who had lied about his age to enlist and barely scraped through advanced flight training in Texas. Arlett possessed an inherent, almost supernatural feel for the rudder and ailerons in level flight. He could fly a Mustang in tight formation, his wingtip mere inches from his flight leaders, with the steady hands of a surgeon. But the moment the nose pointed down, the magic evaporated. Arlett lacked depth perception at high speeds. It was a fatal flaw in a fighter pilot. "Pull up, Doyle. Pull the damn stick back." The voice of Captain Thomas Callahan crackled through the static of Arlett's headset, sharp and panicked. Callahan was a veteran with 4 confirmed kills, a man whose patience had been worn thin by the constant influx of green pilots who ended up as smoking craters in the English countryside. Arlett's gloved hands were white-knuckled on the control column. He was in a mock dogfight, diving at a simulated 45-degree angle toward the patchwork fields of Norfolk. The altimeter was unwinding with terrifying speed: 6,000 feet, 5,000, 4,000. The airspeed indicator needle vibrated past 400 miles per hour. The controls of the Mustang, normally as responsive as a nervous thoroughbred, were stiffening. Compressibility was setting in. The air piling up over the wings was acting like concrete. To Arlett, the ground didn't look like it was rushing up. It looked flat, distant, an abstract painting of green and brown. He misjudged the closure rate entirely. "I've got it, Captain," Arlett breathed into his oxygen mask, his voice trembling. "I've got the angle. You don't have a damn thing. Break off," Callahan roared. Arlett waited 1 second too long. When he finally realized the trees were no longer abstract smudges, but distinct, looming pillars of timber, panic seized him. He hauled back on the stick with both hands. The Mustang shrieked in protest. The sudden onset of G-forces slammed Arlett down into his seat, draining the blood from his brain. The edges of his vision darkened into a gray tunnel. The heavy fighter groaned, its wings flexing dangerously near their structural limits as it clawed its way out of the dive. The propeller wash, violently flattening the winter grass below. He had cleared the tree line by less than 50 feet. Back on the ground, the briefing room smelled of damp wool, stale tobacco, and fear. Callahan stood by the chalkboard, aggressively wiping away the chalk diagrams of flight formations. He didn't look at Arlett, who stood at rigid attention by the doorway, his flight suit soaked in sweat despite the freezing temperature outside. "Do you have a death wish, Doyle?" Callahan finally asked, tossing the eraser onto the desk. "No, sir," Arlett said, his voice tight, "because if you do, there are cheaper ways to manage it than turning a $50,000 aircraft into aluminum confetti." Callahan walked over, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. He was a stocky man, his eyes framed by deep, exhaustion-carved lines. Your target fixated. You dive, you lock up, and you lose all concept of the earth. You think the ground is going to move for you. It won't. I thought I had the altitude, sir. You thought wrong. In combat, the Krauts aren't going to give you a second chance to guess your altitude. A Focke-Wulf will drag you down to the deck, and when he pulls up, you're going to fly straight into a German farmhouse. Callahan sighed, rubbing his temples. I should wash you out. I should ground you right now before you kill yourself, or, God forbid, someone else in my squadron. Arlette felt a cold stone drop in his stomach. To be washed out, to be sent to a transport squadron, or back to the States as a failure, was a humiliation he couldn't bear. Captain, please. My gunnery is good. My formation flying is tight. I need to figure out the dive. Callahan stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the distant, rhythmic coughing of an engine being tested on the flight line. The truth was, Callahan didn't have the luxury of washing him out. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers and escort fighters at a staggering rate. The bloody air battles over Germany were chewing through young men faster than the training commands could produce them. You get one more chance, Doyle, Callahan said softly, his voice devoid of anger, which scared Arlette even more. Tomorrow, we fly a maximum effort to Merseburg. Escort duty. You'll be flying my wing. If you lose your nerve, if you misjudge a single maneuver, I will personally shoot you down myself. Understand? Yes, sir, Arlette said. That night, Arlette didn't sleep. He lay in his narrow cot, staring at the corrugated tin ceiling of the Nissen hut, listening to the wind howl off the North Sea. He played the dive over and over in his mind. He visualized the altimeter, the stiffness of the stick, the optical illusion of the ground. He tried to mathematically calculate the exact moment he needed to pull back, the exact amount of back pressure required. But war was not a mathematical equation. It was a chaotic, violent dance, and Arlette was a boy with 2 left feet. The morning of December 14th was bitterly cold. A thick layer of frost coated the wings of the P-51S, requiring the ground crews to meticulously wipe down the metal to ensure smooth airflow. Arlette stood by his aircraft, a gleaming silver machine, affectionately dubbed Idaho Queen by his crew chief, Sergeant Miller. She's topped off and purring, Lieutenant, Miller said, handing Arlette his parachute harness. Just bring her back in one piece. I just tuned the manifold pressure. Arlette forced a smile, though his lips felt numb. I'll do my best, Miller. The pre-flight briefing had been grim. The target was the Leuna synthetic oil refinery, near Merseburg, one of the most heavily defended pieces of real estate in the Third Reich. The intelligence officer had warned them to expect intense anti-aircraft fire and aggressive fighter opposition from experienced Luftwaffe squadrons. Arlette climbed into the cockpit, the familiar smell of leather, high-octane aviation fuel, and cold metal surrounding him. He strapped himself in, plugging in his oxygen mask and radio leads. Around him, the airfield erupted into a cacophony of sound as dozens of Merlin engines roared to life, spitting blue exhaust smoke into the gray morning air. Blue flight. Check in. Callahan's voice came through the radio, crisp and authoritative. Blue 2. Standing by. Arlette replied, his voice shaking slightly. Blue 3. Ready. Blue 4. Good to go. They taxied onto the grass, a long, lethal line of American industrial might. When it was their turn, Callahan pushed his throttle forward, and Arlette matched his movements perfectly. The acceleration pushed him back into his seat, the tail lifted, and a moment later, the heavy fighter broke the surly bonds of Earth, climbing steeply through the dense English clouds. They broke through the overcast at 10,000 feet into a world of blinding, crystalline sunlight. The sky was an impossible, deep cobalt blue. Ahead of them, stretching for miles across the horizon, were the bomber streams. Hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, their 4 engines churning the thin air, leaving massive, fluffy white contrails that scarred the sky. It was a majestic, terrifying armada. Arlette nestled his Mustang snugly on Callahan's right wing, maintaining perfect formation. For the first 2 hours, the flight was agonizingly mundane. The cold at 25,000 feet seeped through the cockpit heater, freezing the condensation from Arlette's breath onto the inside of the canopy glass. He constantly had to scrape it away with his gloved hand to maintain visibility. As they crossed the Rhine River, the reality of war announced itself. The sky ahead erupted into black, oily smudges. Flak. The German anti-aircraft gunners were waiting for them. "Tighten up, Blue Flight," Callahan ordered. "Keep your eyes peeled. They won't just let the flak do all the work." Arlette's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt incredibly small, suspended in a fragile glass and metal bubble, miles above hostile territory. Every burst of flak buffeted the aircraft, the concussion vibrating through the control stick into his hands. Then, the radio exploded, with panicked chatter. "Bandits! Bandits! 6 o'clock high, coming out of the sun." Arlette craned his neck, looking back over his right shoulder. At first, he saw nothing but the blinding glare of the sun. Then, they materialized, black specks plunging downward at an incredible speed, resolving rapidly into the distinctive, aggressive shapes of Focke-Wulf 190s. Their yellow spinners flashed in the light as they closed the distance. "Brake right! Brake right!" Callahan screamed. Arlette slammed the stick to the right and kicked the rudder pedal, throwing the Mustang into a violent high-G turn. The sudden maneuver pinned him down, the G-suit squeezing his legs to keep the blood in his upper body. Tracer's bright, terrifying streams of red and green light whipped past his canopy, so close he could almost hear them sizzle. The sky devolved into absolute chaos. The neat, orderly formations shattered as dozens of individual dogfights broke out simultaneously. The air was filled with swirling contrails, flashing metal, and the horrifying sight of bombers taking hits, flaming out of the sky in slow, agonizing spirals. Arlette clung to Callahan's wing as the veteran pilot reefed his Mustang through a series of brutal, twisting turns, trying to shake a tenacious Focke-Wulf off their tail. "Doyle, he's on me. Clear my 6, Callahan yelled. Arlette pulled hard, trying to bring his gun sight to bear on the gray camouflaged German fighter. He squeezed the trigger on the stick. The 6, 50 caliber Browning machine guns in his wings roared to life, shuddering the entire aircraft. His aim was off, the tracers sparking harmlessly into the empty air behind the Focke-Wulf. Suddenly, a second German fighter, unseen by Arlette, dove from above. Heavy, 20mm cannon shells tore through the space between Arlette and Callahan. One shell struck Callahan's right wing, shredding the aluminum skin and sending a plume of white glycol coolant venting into the slipstream. "I'm hit! I'm losing pressure!" Callahan called out, his voice tense but controlled. "I'm diving for the deck. Cover me, Doyle." Callahan pushed his nose down, rolling the damaged Mustang onto its back and plummeting toward the earth to escape the attacking fighters. Arlette didn't hesitate. He rolled his aircraft and followed his flight leader into the abyss. This was the exact scenario Arlette dreaded. A high-speed, vertical dive. As they plummeted past 15,000 feet, the speed rapidly built up. The wind shrieked. The controls began to stiffen. Arlette's breathing became shallow, rapid gasps inside his mask. He looked in his rearview mirror. 4 Focke-Wulfs had broken off from the main furball and were diving after them, smelling blood. They were arrayed in a loose, deadly formation, closing the distance. "Captain, we have company," Arlette said, fighting to keep the panic out of his voice. 4 bandits, closing fast. "I can't outrun them, Doyle." "My engine is seizing," Callahan replied, his aircraft trailing thick black smoke now. "You have to break off. Save yourself. Get up into the clouds." "Negative, sir. I'm staying with you." "That's an order, Lieutenant. Break off." Before Arlette could argue, the lead Focke-Wulf opened fire. Tracers bracketed Arlette's cockpit, He instinctively jinked, throwing the stick left, then right. In doing so, he lost his alignment with Callahan. Within seconds, the superior speed of the diving German fighters drove a wedge between them. Two Focke-Wulfs stayed on the smoking trail of Callahan's descending plane, while the other two, realizing Arlette was the healthy target, shifted their crosshairs onto him. Arlette was completely alone, separated from his squadron, plummeting toward the German countryside at over 450 miles per hour, with two veteran killers locked onto his tail. The lead pursuing Focke-Wulf was piloted by Oberleutnant Erich Kessler, an ace with 32 confirmed victories. To Kessler, the silver Mustang diving erratically ahead of him was not a threat. It was prey. The American was flying like a frightened rabbit, making jerky, panicked corrections that bled off precious speed. Kessler smiled beneath his oxygen mask, easily keeping his crosshairs trained on the Mustang's tail empennage. He just needed to get a few hundred yards closer before unleashing his heavy cannons. In the cockpit of the Idaho Queen, Arlette was losing his mind. The altimeter was spinning violently, 8,000, 7,000, 6,000 feet. The needle on his airspeed indicator was bouncing against the red line. The aircraft was shaking so violently that the instrument dials were becoming a blur. Compressibility had him in its icy grip. The air rushing over the Mustang's laminar flow wings had reached transonic speeds, creating shock waves that disrupted the airflow over the tail elevators. When Arlette tried to pull back on the stick to shallow out the dive, it felt as though it had been set in hardened cement. The nose refused to come up. He was experiencing a phenomenon known as Mach tuck. As the center of lift shifted backward at high speeds, the nose of the aircraft was naturally forced further downward, steepening the dive. It was a death spiral. Arlette looked out the canopy. The ground was rushing up with terrifying speed. He could see the intricate details of the snow-dusted German fields, the dark lines of hedges, a winding river. It wasn't an abstract painting anymore. It was an anvil, and he was the hammer falling toward it. His mind flashed back to Callahan's words in the briefing room. You dive, you lock up, and you lose all concept of the earth. Come up! Come up! Come up! Arlette chanted frantically, hauling back on the heavy control stick with both hands. His boots braced hard against the rudder pedals. Nothing happened. The aircraft continued its screaming descent. 5,000 feet. 4,000. Behind him, Kessler saw the Mustang lock into its fatal trajectory. The German pilot eased off his own throttle, preparing to pull out of the dive smoothly. He had seen this a dozen times before. The green American pilot had panicked, oversped his airframe, and was about to plow a fiery trench into the frozen soil. Kessler didn't even need to waste his ammunition. He gently began to apply back pressure to his stick, guiding his Focke-Wulf into a shallow, sweeping recovery curve. At 3,000 feet, Arlette snapped. The sheer terror of imminent impact overrode all his training, all his logic, and all understanding of aerodynamics. He didn't execute a smooth, calculated recovery. He didn't adjust his trim tabs to slowly bring the nose up. Blinded by panic, Arlette did everything violently wrong at the exact same moment. He chopped the throttle back to idle, instantly killing the engine's thrust and throwing the massive torque of the propeller out of balance. Simultaneously, he shoved his left leg forward with all his might, kicking full left rudder. And with his hands, he didn't just pull back. He yanked the stick hard into his right hip, crossing the controls entirely. At 480 miles per hour, in thick, low-altitude air, these control inputs were suicidal. They should have ripped the wings clean off the fuselage. Instead, a bizarre combination of aerodynamic anomalies occurred. The sudden reduction of engine power caused a massive deceleration drag from the massive four-bladed propeller. The hard left rudder threw the aircraft's nose violently sideways into the slipstream, presenting the entire flat flank of the Mustang to the hurricane-force wind. The hard back right stick commanded the elevators to pitch up, while the ailerons tried to roll the plane right. The result was an instantaneous, catastrophic stall at high speed. The Idaho Queen didn't turn. It didn't loop. It snapped. The heavy tail of the aircraft whipped around faster than the eye could follow. The Mustang was suddenly flying backward through the air, completely devoid of lift, tumbling like a tossed brick. The immense deceleration force was equivalent to hitting a brick wall. Arlette was thrown violently forward against his shoulder straps, his head snapping down, the breath expelled from his lungs in a sharp grunt. The airframe screamed, popping rivets and warping aluminum plates as it absorbed G-forces it was never designed to withstand. For a terrifying, weightless second, the Mustang hung in the air, pointing almost straight up at the sky, skidding backward while moving forward on its remaining momentum. Oberleutnant Kessler, tracking perfectly in his smooth parabolic pullout, suddenly found himself staring at empty air. One fraction of a second, the Mustang was a doomed speck hurtling toward the ground in front of him. The next fraction of a second, it simply wasn't there. It had stopped mid-air, a violent visual impossibility. Kessler, traveling at over 400 miles per hour, blew right past the tumbling Mustang. His wingman, tucked tightly on his right side, was equally stunned. Before Kessler could process what had happened, his brain registering the sheer absurdity of the American fighter stopping dead in the sky, he realized he was out of altitude. He had planned to level out at 500 feet, but the sudden disappearance of his target had caused him to hesitate on his pullout for just a fraction of a second. It was a fatal fraction. Kessler hauled his stick back, his Focke-Wulf groaning under the strain. He cleared the snow-covered field, but he didn't see the heavy stone chimney of a German farmhouse rising from the edge of the property. Kessler's right wing clipped the chimney at 400 miles per hour. The Focke-Wulf cartwheeled violently, a spectacular explosion of fuel, wood, and metal that erupted across the frozen ground. Arlette, meanwhile, was fighting for his life inside the tumbling Mustang. As the aircraft snapped and pointed its nose toward the sky, bleeding off all its speed in an instant, gravity reasserted its dominance. The heavy Merlin engine pulled the nose down, and the aircraft began to fall like a stone. But as the nose dropped, the airspeed indicator began to creep up. 50, 80, 100 miles per hour. The controls, which had been frozen concrete moments before, suddenly became light and mushy. Arlette, operating purely on adrenaline and instinct, centralized the stick and rudder. The laminar wings bit into the air, and the Mustang recovered from the stall, now flying level at a mere 800 feet above the ground. He had survived. He had miraculously cheated death. But the engagement wasn't over. Kessler's wingman, a young Feldwebel named Hans, had watched his flight leader vaporize against the farmhouse. Enraged and confused, Hans pulled his Focke-Wulf into a tight, screaming loop, bleeding off his own speed to come back down on the Mustang that had somehow defied physics. Arlette, panting heavily, sweat stinging his eyes, saw the remaining German fighter dropping down on him from the 1 o'clock position. The Focke-Wulf was coming in steep, its cannons already winking angry flashes of light. Arlette didn't panic this time. The absolute terror of the dive had burned away all his anxiety, leaving a cold, hyper-focused clarity. He realized that because of his bizarre maneuver, he was now moving incredibly slow, while the attacking German was diving fast. Instead of turning to run, Arlette hauled back on the stick. Because he was flying at optimal maneuver speed now, the Mustang responded beautifully. The nose pitched up sharply, directly into the path of the diving Focke-Wulf. It was a terrifying game of aerial chicken. The German pilot, expecting Arlette to evade, found himself staring straight down the barrels of 6 .50 caliber machine guns. Arlette didn't aim through his sight. He felt the alignment in his gut. As the gray mass of the Focke-Wulf filled his windshield, he squeezed the trigger and held it down. The heavy Browning machine guns hammered, sending a dense stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds straight up. The closing speed was massive. The German pilot had no time to evade. Arlette's stream of fire walked a line from the Focke-Wulf's engine, cowling through the cockpit canopy and straight back to the tail. The German fighter shuddered violently, throwing off pieces of metal and shattered plexiglass. It pitched over hard, missing Arlette's canopy by mere feet, trailing a massive plume of white smoke before plunging nose first into the forest below. A secondary explosion shook the air. Arlette leveled out his Mustang, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the throttle. He looked down at the two plumes of black smoke rising from the German winter landscape. He hadn't just survived his greatest weakness. He had accidentally weaponized it. Blue 2. "This is Blue Leader." Callahan's voice crackled through the static, sounding weak but alive. "I managed to pull out. I'm limping toward the channel. What's your status, Doyle?" Arlette swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. "This is Blue 2. I'm clear, Captain. 2 bandits down." There was a long pause on the radio. 2? How the hell did you manage that, kid? Arlette looked at his trembling hands, then out at the sky. He had no idea how to explain the violent, physics-breaking tumble he had just survived. He didn't know what it was called, because it hadn't existed until 30 seconds ago. "I don't know, Captain," Arlette breathed into his mask. "But I think I just invented something." Rain battered the tin roof of the debriefing hut at RAF Bodney, perfectly matching the chaotic pounding in Arlette Doyle's chest. Hours had passed since his wheels touched the frosted tarmac, yet his hands still carried a faint, involuntary tremor. The Idaho Queen sat outside in the freezing drizzle, her aluminum skin buckled near the wing roots, a physical testament to the aerodynamic violence she had endured. Inside the dimly lit room, the atmosphere was a stifling mixture of stale cigarette smoke, damp wool, and disbelief. Captain Thomas Callahan sat at the wooden table, his right arm bound tightly in a stark white sling. His face was pale, lines of exhaustion etched deeply around his eyes, but his gaze was fixed intently on the flickering wall ahead. Behind them, a projector hummed a steady, mechanical rhythm. Private First Class Gordon H. Smith, a real wizard from the Photo Reconnaissance and Gunnery Division, meticulously fed the 16mm Kodak film from Arlette's wing-mounted camera into the machine. "All right, Doyle." Major Harrison, the squadron's intelligence officer, said from the shadows. "Walk us through it again, because right now, the physics boys in engineering think you're spinning them a fairy tale." Arlette stood near the chalkboard, feeling the weight of the older men's scrutiny. "I didn't plan it, Major. I was locked up in the dive. Compressibility had the stick frozen solid. Oberleutnant Kessler, at least, we think it was him based on the yellow cowl markings, was riding my tail, waiting for me to auger in." "Roll the film, Smitty," Callahan ordered quietly. The projector clattered to life. The black and white footage flickered onto the plaster wall, instantly transporting the men back to the terrifying vertical plummet over Germany. The camera shook violently, capturing the blurring, snow-covered earth, rushing upward at a sickening pace. The altimeter, in the corner of the frame, unwound like a broken clock. "Right here," Arlette said, his voice tightening. "This is where I panicked." On the screen, the impossible happened. The smooth, deadly dive shattered into absolute chaos. The nose of the Mustang jerked violently to the left, while the entire horizon flipped upside down and spun. The camera perspective was thrown completely out of axis, pointing at the empty sky, then the ground, then nothing but chaotic gray blurs. The sheer violence of the maneuver was jarring even on silent film. Then, just as suddenly, the spinning stopped. The camera leveled out, pointing straight ahead. Plumes of black smoke rose lazily from a shattered German farmhouse in the distance. Kessler's demise. A second later, the nose pitched up sharply. The heavy tracers of Arlette's .50 calibers illuminated the frame, and the second Focke-Wulf flew directly into the hail of lead, disintegrating in a shower of debris before plummeting out of sight. The film flapped wildly against the take-up reel as the footage ended. The room fell into a heavy, stunned silence. "God Almighty," Major Harrison whispered, rubbing his jaw. "You didn't fly out of that dive, son. You crashed in midair and survived." Callahan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Wally, what exactly did he do to that airframe?" Lieutenant Robert Wally Dawson, the chief engineering officer, stepped out of the corner, clutching a clipboard covered in grease-stained calculations. He looked at Arlette as if the young pilot were a ghost. "He effectively hit an invisible brick wall," Dawson explained, tapping his pen against the board. "By chopping the throttle to 0 at 480 miles an hour, he turned that four-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller into a massive air brake. Then, by crossing the control's hard left rudder, hard back right stick, he intentionally induced a high-speed, uncoordinated stall." Dawson walked over to a wooden model of a P-51 sitting on the desk. "The laminar flow wing of the Mustang is designed for high speed, low drag. When it stalls, it doesn't give you a polite warning. It snaps." Doyle basically threw the aircraft into a violent flat spin while hurtling straight down. The airframe pancaked against the wind. The deceleration forces must have been upwards of 9 Gs. It completely broke the target track of the pursuing German. To the Kraut, Doyle's plane didn't just slow down. It functionally stopped in mid-air. "Can the airframe take that kind of punishment?" Callahan asked. "Once?" "Apparently," Dawson replied grimly. "I just inspected the Idaho Queen. The main wing spars are stressed, and we lost a dozen rivets on the tail empennage. If he had held that maneuver for 1 second longer, the wings would have clapped together over his head." "It was a fluke," Major Harrison concluded, shaking his head. "A 1 in a million panic reaction that happened to save his skin. Good job, Doyle, but don't ever try it again. You've used up your guardian angel's patience for the entire war." "With respect, Major," Arlette spoke up, surprising himself with his own firmness. The terror of the dive had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating realization. "It wasn't a fluke. It was a mechanical input. I remember exactly what I did with my hands and feet. If I can replicate it under controlled conditions—" "Are you out of your mind?" Callahan barked, wincing as the sudden movement pulled at his injured shoulder. "You heard Dawson. It nearly ripped the plane apart. You're talking about weaponizing a catastrophic failure." "I'm talking about an equalizer, Captain," Arlette insisted, stepping closer to the table. "You said it yourself. I'm target fixated. I can't judge a standard dive recovery. But this doesn't require finesse. It requires violence. If a Focke-Wulf or a Messerschmitt drags me down to the deck, they expect me to either pull out smoothly or crash. If I throw this snap maneuver, I force them to overshoot. Instantly, I go from being the prey to having them dead in my sights." Callahan stared at the young farm boy. The frightened, washed-out cadet was gone. In his place stood a pilot who had stared into the abyss, broken the rules of aerodynamics, and come out the other side with a terrifying new weapon. "You're a madman, Doyle," Callahan said softly. "Maybe," Arlette replied, "but I'm a madman with 2 confirmed kills. Give me 3 days, Captain. Let me take the Queen up to 20,000 feet and figure out the exact tolerance. Let me perfect it." Callahan looked at Major Harrison, then at Dawson. The brass was desperate. They were losing seasoned veterans every week, and the skies over the Reich were only growing more lethal. 3 days. "Arlette," Callahan finally said, his voice heavy with reluctant permission. "Dawson, reinforce those wing spars. Give him whatever he needs. But if you auger in during testing, Doyle, I'm going to find your ghost and court-martial it." Sergeant Miller did not speak to Arlette for the first 2 days. The veteran crew chief treated the Idaho Queen like a beloved daughter, and seeing her aluminum skin, wrinkled from extreme stress, had broken his heart. Working through the freezing nights, under the harsh glare of floodlights, Miller and his crew stripped the wings down, welding heavy steel reinforcement plates along the main spar and double riveting the tail section. On the morning of the 3rd day, the sky over Norfolk was a brilliant, cloudless blue, offering unlimited visibility. Arlette climbed into the cockpit, his muscles aching with a preemptive tension. He was wearing an experimental anti-G suit, tightly laced around his calves and thighs, to prevent the blood from rushing from his brain during extreme maneuvers. "She's heavier now," Miller said, standing on the wing root and leaning into the cockpit. The older man's face was smeared with grease. The reinforcements added about 200 pounds. "She won't turn quite as sweet in a sustained dogfight, but her spine is made of iron. You try to rip her wings off again, Lieutenant, and you'll have to answer to me." "I'll bring her back, Miller," Arlette promised. Taking off was noticeably different. The added weight made the Mustang sluggish off the grass. But once the massive Merlin engine caught the dense winter air, the Idaho Queen climbed like a rocket. Arlette leveled off at 22,000 feet over the churning gray expanse of the North Sea. Up here, alone in the vast emptiness, there was no enemy flak, no swarms of yellow-nosed German fighters. Just Arlette, his machine, and the terrifying laws of physics he was about to challenge. He keyed his radio. "Bodney Tower, this is Blue 2. Commencing test dive. Altitude 22,000. Over." "Copy that, Blue 2, the tower operator replied, sounding distinctly nervous. "Medical teams are on standby. Good luck, son." Arlette took a deep breath of pure oxygen from his mask. He rolled the Mustang onto her back and pulled the stick, pointing the nose straight down toward the dark, freezing water miles below. The acceleration was immediate and brutal. The wind shrieked against the canopy. The altimeter spun. 18,000, 15,000, 12,000. The airspeed indicator crossed 400 miles per hour. The controls began to solidify, the icy grip of compressibility seizing the control surfaces. Arlette's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to pull back smoothly, to fight the dive as he had been taught in Texas. "Wait for it," he told himself, watching the needle climb. 450, 460. At 10,000 feet, traveling at 480 miles per hour, Arlette executed the sequence. He didn't panic this time. The movements were deliberate, violent, and precise. He chopped the throttle back with his left hand, violently severing the engine's thrust. Simultaneously, he kicked the left rudder pedal to the floorboard and hauled the heavy control stick hard into his right hip. The world exploded. The violence of the maneuver was far worse when anticipated. The heavy fighter snapped perfectly sideways, shedding its aerodynamic profile in a fraction of a second. The deceleration force hit Arlette like a freight train. The G-suit inflated violently, crushing his legs. But it wasn't enough. The blood drained from his face. His vision collapsed into a pinpoint of light, then snapped entirely to black. He was unconscious. The Idaho Queen, essentially a 10,000-pound anvil thrown sideways into a hurricane, tumbled backward through the sky. She lost 4,000 feet of altitude in less than 10 seconds, bleeding off speed at an astronomical rate. Inside the cockpit, Arlette's head lolled against the canopy glass. As the aircraft slowed, the colossal G-forces subsided. Oxygen flooded back into his brain. His vision swam back to reality, in a wash of gray and red. The first thing he saw was the altimeter, 5,000 feet. The nose was pointing steeply downward again, the airspeed creeping back up. He was in a standard, recoverable stall, gasping for air, his ribs aching violently from the shoulder harness. Arlette centralized the controls and pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin roared, the laminar wings bit into the air, and the Mustang scooped smoothly out of the dive, leveling off at 3,000 feet above the white-capped sea. He had done it. He had purposely triggered the catastrophic stall, survived the G-force blackout, and recovered the aircraft. "Bodney Tower, this is Blue 2, Arlette croaked into the radio, his voice raw. "Test 1 complete. Aircraft is intact." Cheers erupted through the static of the radio. Even Callahan, listening from the ground, let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. But Arlette wasn't finished. Blacking out was unacceptable in combat. If he lost consciousness for even a second with an enemy on his tail, he would wake up dead. He needed to find the exact tolerance, the sweet spot, where the snap was violent enough to force an overshoot, but survivable enough to keep his eyes open. He climbed back to altitude. Again and again, he threw the Idaho Queen into the abyss. He bruised his shoulders, popped blood vessels in his forearms, and tested the absolute structural limits of the reinforced wing spars. By the fifth dive, he found the mathematical poetry of the violence. If he initiated the snap at exactly 420 miles per hour and released the cross controls a fraction of a second after the tail whipped around, the Mustang wouldn't tumble uncontrollably. Instead, it performed a vicious, skidding backflip. The nose would pitch straight up, acting like a giant, flat air brake, instantly bleeding off 200 miles per hour of speed, before flopping forward back into a controlled glide. It was a maneuver of terrifying beauty. It was the ultimate defensive reversal. When Arlette finally landed, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the English sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. He taxied to his hardstand, cut the engine, and practically fell out of the cockpit. His flight suit was soaked in sweat, and he shook with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Sergeant Miller was there to catch him, grabbing Arlette by the shoulders to keep him upright. The crew chief ran his hands over the reinforced wing roots, checking the rivets with a flashlight. "She held," Miller muttered in awe. "God almighty, Lieutenant," she held. Callahan drove up in a Willys Jeep, slamming the brakes and stepping out into the cold evening air. He looked at Arlette, taking in the young pilot's bruised face and exhausted posture. "Did you figure it out, kid?" Callahan asked quietly. "I figured it out," Arlette nodded, wiping grease from his forehead. "I call it the Doyle snap. It's an aggressive deceleration stall. If they follow me down, I can break the plane in midair. They'll blow right past me." Callahan stared out at the flight line, where dozens of P-51s were being prepped for the next day's mission. The war machine never slept. The intelligence briefings had been grim. The Luftwaffe was changing tactics. They were holding back their green pilots and sending up the Experten, the hardened, veteran killers who had survived years on the Eastern Front, flying heavily armed and up-engined Focke-Wulf 190D 9S. The Doris. "Good," Callahan said, his voice hard as steel. "Because tomorrow, we're going to need it. 8th Air Force is launching a maximum effort deep into the Ruhr Valley. We're escorting the heavies straight into the hornet's nest." Callahan tossed Arlette a fresh pack of Lucky Strikes. "Rest up, Doyle. Tomorrow, you prove if you're a genius or just a ghost waiting to happen. Altitude is currency in a dogfight. And on the morning of December 18th, the 352nd Fighter Group was bankrupt. The 8th Air Force bomber stream, a massive armada of over 800 B-17 Flying Fortresses, was grinding its way toward the synthetic oil refineries of the Ruhr Valley, a heavily industrialized, flak-choked region the bomber crews grimly referred to as Happy Valley. Arlette Doyle sat in the reinforced cockpit of the Idaho Queen, flying on Captain Callahan's right wing at 26,000 feet. The ambient temperature outside the plexiglass canopy was a lethal 60 degrees below zero. Ice crystals formed on Arlette's oxygen mask with every exhalation, and his toes had gone entirely numb an hour ago. Despite the bitter cold, Arlette was sweating inside his fleece-lined flight suit. The airwaves were eerily silent. The German radar stations had undoubtedly tracked their massive formation since they crossed the English Channel. Yet the Luftwaffe had not risen to meet them over the coast. They were waiting. "Keep your heads on a swivel, Blue Flight," Callahan's voice crackled, breaking the tense silence. "They're holding back. That means they're massing for a concentrated pass. Don't drift." Just as the sprawling, snow-covered industrial complexes of the Ruhr came into view beneath the scattered overcast, the sky ahead erupted. It wasn't a standard interception. It was an ambush of terrifying scale. Diving out of the blinding glare of the high-altitude sun came over 40 German fighters. But these were not the standard, blunt-nosed Focke-Wulf 190S Arlette had faced days prior. These were the FWV 190D9S, the long-nosed Doris, equipped with a massive, inline Junkers Jumo engine. The Dora was arguably the finest piston engine fighter the Luftwaffe had ever produced. They were blisteringly fast, heavily armored, and flown entirely by the expertin, the hardened, elite veterans, recalled from the Eastern Front to defend the fatherland. Leading the assault was Major Heinrich Richter, a ruthless tactician with over 90 confirmed kills, flying a Dora with a distinctive black and white checkered engine, cowling. "Bandits! High at 12 o'clock! Break! Break!" The radio channel dissolved into absolute pandemonium. The Doras didn't engage in turning dogfights. They employed brutal boom-and-zoom tactics. They slashed through the American fighter screen at over 450 miles per hour, cannons blazing, before using their superior kinetic energy to zoom back up to altitude, completely untouchable. Within the first 60 seconds, the sky became a graveyard. 3 P-51s from the lead squadron were immediately turned into falling torches. The orderly defensive screen shattered as individual pilots broke formation to survive. Arlette wrenched the control stick hard to the left, standing the Idaho Queen on her reinforced wingtip to avoid a stream of 20mm cannon shells that sawed through the airspace where he had been a second before. He looked back to find Callahan, but the sky was a chaotic swirl of contrails, black flak bursts, and burning machinery. "Captain, where are you?" Arlette yelled into his mask. Static. And then, a garbled transmission. "Lost oil pressure. I'm bailing out." "Good luck, kid." Arlette was alone. Again. He leveled off at 24,000 feet, his head swiveling wildly as he checked his 6 o'clock blind spot. What he saw made his blood run cold. Major Richter had spotted the solitary, silver Mustang. To a predator like Richter, a separated American fighter was nothing more than target practice. But Richter wasn't alone. Following closely behind the checkered-nosed ace were 6 other Doras, arrayed in a loose but deadly trail formation, a full swarm, and a supporting Keta. 7 elite Luftwaffe killers had mutually decided to make Arlette Doyle their afternoon entertainment. "Okay, Doyle," Arlette whispered to himself, his voice shaking but strangely calm. "You wanted the proving grounds. You got them." Richter's Dora accelerated, closing the gap with terrifying speed. The yellow flashes of his wing-root cannons winked angrily in the freezing air. Tracers zipped past Arlette's canopy, close enough that he could hear the supersonic crack of the rounds displacing the air. Arlette didn't try to outturn them. The heavy steel plates Sergeant Miller had welded into his wing roots made the Idaho Queen too sluggish in a flat, sustained turn against the highly maneuverable Doris. There was only one direction he could go to buy time. Down. Arlette shoved the stick forward, kicking the rudder to throw the Mustang into a steep, plunging dive toward the German, industrial sprawl below. Behind him, Richter smiled behind his oxygen mask. The American was making the classic rookie mistake. The Dora was significantly heavier and more aerodynamic in a steep dive than the P-51. Richter simply pushed his own nose down, signaled his 6 wingmen to follow, and began the pursuit. It was no longer a dogfight. It was an execution. The altimeter unwound with a sickening blur. 20,000, 16,000, 12,000 feet. The wind shrieked over the canopy of the Idaho Queen, a deafening roar that drowned out the massive Merlin engine. The airspeed indicator blasted past 400 miles per hour. The controls began to stiffen as the invisible, crushing grip of compressibility took hold. Arlette's experimental anti-G suit was already inflating, squeezing his calves and thighs to keep the blood in his upper body. He glanced in his rearview mirror. The 7 Focke-Wulfs were directly behind him, stacked in a staggered line, perfectly matching his dive. They were less than 500 yards away, riding his slipstream, just waiting for him to either pull up or crash into the earth. Not yet, Arlette thought, his eyes glued to the airspeed needle. Wait for the math. Wait for the poetry. 9,000 feet. 410 miles per hour. The ground was a rapidly expanding mosaic of factory roofs, smokestacks, and snow-covered railway yards. Richter closed the distance to 300 yards. He didn't even bother to aim through his sight. At this range, and in this steep of a dive, He simply had to wait for the American to inevitably lock up and die. Richter relaxed his grip on the stick, preparing for a smooth, sweeping pullout. 3,000 feet. 420 miles per hour. Terminal velocity. Now, Arlette screamed. He didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch. Arlette Doyle, an 18-year-old farm boy with a history of failing dive recoveries, executed the most violent aerodynamic maneuver ever conceived. His left hand slammed the throttle back to zero. The four-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller instantly transformed into a massive, drag-inducing air brake. Simultaneously, his left boot stomped the rudder pedal entirely to the floorboard, throwing the nose of the 10,000-pound aircraft sideways into a hurricane-force wind. And with his right hand, he hauled the heavy control stick violently back and to the right, crossing the controls perfectly. The Doyle snap was unleashed. The Idaho Queen hit the invisible brick wall. The laminar flow wings suffered a catastrophic, instantaneous high-speed stall. The aircraft snapped sideways and pitched violently upward, effectively flipping into a skidding backflip while traveling at over 400 miles per hour. The deceleration force was apocalyptic. 9 negative Gs slammed Arlette forward against his shoulder straps with bone-bruising force. His vision instantly blacked out, plunging him into darkness. The reinforced steel wing spars shrieked in protest, the airframe groaning as it absorbed stresses that should have turned it into flying shrapnel. But it held. For Major Heinrich Richter, the world simply ceased to make sense. 1 millisecond, the silver Mustang was trapped in his crosshairs. The next millisecond, the Mustang presented its entire flat belly to him, shedding 200 miles per hour of airspeed in the blink of an eye. Richter was closing at 450 miles per hour. He had less than half a second to react. Driven by pure survival instinct, Richter wrenched his control stick hard to the right, desperately trying to avoid ramming the stationary Mustang. His Dora banked violently, but he forgot about the 6 heavily armed fighters, tucked tightly in formation, right behind his tail. Richter's Dora sheared directly into the path of his immediate wingman, Lieutenant Klaus Weber. The mid-air collision was spectacular. A massive fireball erupted in the sky as the two Focke-Wulfs obliterated each other, sending thousands of pieces of burning aluminum, engine blocks, and shattered plexiglass scattering through the air like a deadly shotgun blast. The 5 remaining German pilots, plunging at terminal velocity, suddenly found themselves flying directly into a wall of fire and debris. Absolute panic set in. The rigid discipline of the Luftwaffe Experten shattered. The 3rd and 4th Doris in the formation, blinded by the explosion, instinctively yanked back on their control sticks to escape the fireball. But at that speed and at that altitude, pulling extreme G-forces without a specialized suit resulted in an immediate, catastrophic blackout. The 2 pilots slumped over their controls. Their heavy fighters screamed out of the dive, totally unguided, and plowed nose first into the German railway yard below, erupting in twin pillars of black smoke and earth. The remaining 3 German fighters managed to thread the needle, desperately jinking through the shower of flaming debris. But in doing so, they completely blew past the Idaho Queen. Inside his cockpit, Arlette's vision swam back into focus. He gasped for air, his lungs burning. The altimeter read 2,000 feet. The Idaho Queen was hanging in the air, pointing almost straight up, its airspeed hovering near stall speed. Gravity took over, pulling the heavy Merlin engine down. As the nose of the Mustang dropped, presenting a perfect view of the sky directly below him, Arlette saw the 3 surviving Doras, frantically trying to pull out of their dives directly in front of his gun sights. He pushed the throttle to military power. The Merlin engine roared back to life, the wings catching the air. Arlette had the ultimate energy advantage. He was above them, and they were bleeding speed trying to climb away from the ground. Arlette centralized his stick and squeezed the trigger. The 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns hammered, sending a dense, lethal cone of armor-piercing incendiary rounds downward. The stream of fire walked perfectly across the spine of the 5th Focke-Wulf. The heavy bullets shattered the canopy, instantly killing the pilot, before ripping into the inline engine. The Dora snapped into a violent roll and plummeted into a factory smokestack. The two surviving Germans, realizing the impossible had happened, scattered in opposite directions. Arlette picked the one braking left. The Mustang, now light and responsive at a lower speed, carved through the air effortlessly. Arlette pulled lead on the fleeing German, tracking him through his gyroscopic gun sight. He fired a 2-second burst. The right wing of the Dora simply folded backward, severed by the sheer volume of lead. The aircraft spun wildly out of control, crashing into a frozen field. The seventh and final German pilot, witnessing the annihilation of his entire elite squadron in less than 30 seconds, broke completely. He didn't even try to fight. He rolled his Dora upside down, popped the canopy, and bailed out, his white parachute blossoming over the carnage below. Arlette eased back on the throttle, his breathing ragged, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold the stick. He circled the airspace once. Below him, the snow-covered earth of the Ruhr Valley was scarred by 7 distinct, burning pyres. He hadn't just survived. He had orchestrated a massacre. The flight back to RAF Bodny was a blur of exhaustion and mechanical anxiety. The Idaho Queen was battered. The extreme G-forces had warped the aileron cables, making the stick heavy and unresponsive, and the engine was running dangerously hot. But Sergeant Miller's steel plates had held. When Arlette finally cut the engine on the frosty English tarmac, he didn't have the strength to climb out of the cockpit. Ground crews rushed the aircraft, their eyes widening at the buckled aluminum and popped rivets along the fuselage. Major Harrison and Lieutenant Dawson were the first onto the wing route. They found Arlette staring blankly at the instrument panel, his face bruised purple from the G-suit and shoulder straps. "Doyle," Harrison said, his voice hushed. "The bomber boys. They saw it from above. They said an entire German squadron just fell out of the sky behind you. What the hell happened?" Arlette slowly turned his head, unhooking his oxygen mask. He looked at Dawson, then at the sky, a tired, humorless smile touching his lips. "I slammed on the brakes, Major," Arlette whispered, "and they forgot to stop." The legend of the Doyle snap spread through the Allied air forces like wildfire, though it was rarely successfully replicated. It required a specific, suicidal bravery, a willingness to invite catastrophic structural failure to achieve absolute tactical surprise. Arlette Doyle, the farm boy who couldn't judge a dive, had intuitively understood something the textbook engineers hadn't. In the chaotic, high-speed geometry of aerial warfare, survival sometimes required throwing the physics book out the canopy. By weaponizing his own panic and turning a fatal flaw into an aggressive mechanical sequence, he decimated a squadron of the Luftwaffe's most elite killers. His maneuver proved that while machines have limits defined by mathematics, the human will to survive operates entirely outside the boundaries of reason, forever changing the doctrine of defensive dogfighting.